Okay, so that was our first topic. Medyo mag-English na ako ng konti ngayon because our guest is an American, okay? We need to speak in English, okay? So for this particular portion of our discussion, we have Mr. Gregory Poling. He is the director of the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative of the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Good evening, Greg. Or good morning there. Where are you? Washington?
I'm outside of Washington, Christian. Although I don't know what time it is because I got back from the Philippines early this week, and then I was on another plane last night that got delayed till 2 a.m. So
Yeah.
good evening, good afternoon. My brain doesn't know.
Good day, good day. How are you? You were in the Philippines. You did what? I understand you launched a book, right?
I did. So I was in. I spent 2 days in Manila, two in Cebu, two in Puerto Princesa. I was originally there because the Philippine Air Force invited me to speak at their annual conference. It was the first time they had returned in person at the Manila Marriott next to VMware Air Base. But then I stuck around for a week to do book launch events. Now, unfortunately, my book was delayed because everything in COVID is delayed. So I didn't
But
actually have copies on hand like I had hoped to, but they were still good events.
but by the way, what's the title of your book and when is this going to be available?
So it's called On Dangerous Ground: America's Century in the South China Sea. As it indicates, it's a kind of the South China Sea story written from an American perspective. So the history of U.S. involvement, which is pretty tightly bound up in the history of the U.S.-Philippine alliance. It launched this morning on Kindle for those who like to read on their Kindles or their phones, and then the hard copies will start shipping in the U.S. A week from today.
Okay, let's talk about the South China Sea Challenge to our new president, the president of the Philippines, President Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr. He had his inauguration already yesterday. And we didn't hear much about his foreign policy during the campaign or during the inauguration. But there were certain statements that propped up during the campaign. For example, the invocation of the arbitral victory in 2016. In your case, what kind of challenge are you seeing for this new administration, given the strategic importance of the Philippines, both for China, the United States, and other powers in this part of the world?
The administration is coming in to power in a tough spot because the previous administration spent 6 years ignoring the 2016 arbitration award, and at least the first 3 or 4 years of the Duterte government were spent kind of ignoring the whole West Philippine Sea issue overall. The result is that the Philippines, only in the last year to two, has really started thinking through how to in the alliance with the Americans and how to more proactively pursue its rights in the West Philippine Sea, while China's spent all of this time getting stronger and taking more than it had and building up its facilities in the islands. So the Marcos administration comes in with the deck stacked against it far more than the Duterte government had in 2016.
And how do you think the new administration should proceed from here on?
Look, I'm always hesitant to give advice to partner governments. My job is to give advice to the U.S. government. Um, the most important thing I think for both countries at the moment, the government seems to have decided, is to tighten the alliance. So we've seen a lot of work since Secretary of Defense Austin visited Manila last July, and Secretary Lorenzana returned the visit to Washington in August. A lot of effort spent on deepening and modernizing and fixing the alliance, because at the end of the day, there are no military solutions to the South China Sea, but military deterrence has to be part of the strategy, preventing China from simply using force to resolve this in Beijing's favor, particularly toward the Sierra Madre.
Mm. Okay, Sierra Madre. This is of course BRP Sierra Madre, which has long been beached on Ayungin Shoal, right? Um, let's talk about the friendship that was established by former President Rodrigo Duterte with China. We've heard the assessments regarding that. Many experts were saying that that particular closeness of ties that was established by the former president didn't exactly benefit the Philippines from the big perspective or using that big picture. But here you have the new president, Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr., who has also been trumpeting the so-called friendship or closeness even between his family and Beijing. How do you think this could benefit the Philippines, or whether we are bound to actually experience the same experience that we had during the Duterte administration when it comes to Beijing.
I hope it will not be the same experience. If China was a friend to the Duterte government, it was a very abusive friend, a friend that never paid its bills and then took advantage of the Philippines at every turn. Everything that we've heard from President Marcos suggests that he's going to attempt some outreach to Beijing, and I suppose that's natural. Every president comes in wanting, understandably, to find some path forward, some diplomatic way ahead. And I'm afraid there simply isn't one. If there was, the Duterte government would have found it in the first 3 to 4 years when they were doing everything they could to reach out to China. The fact is, China doesn't want to compromise. It has no incentive to cut any
Why?
deals with Manila because it's winning every day. Every single day, China is in more control of fishing and oil and gas and law enforcement operations and everything else in the South China Sea. And it pays no cost so far for that bad behavior. So why should it compromise with the Philippines? And on the other hand, the Philippines needs, wants Chinese investment, loans, capital, and we saw over the course of the Duterte presidency that China made a lot of promises and delivered very little of the economic largesse that was promised. So I expect that there will be flirtations under the new administration, but I also think this administration is so far being staffed with professionals, competent bureaucrats who know their history, their recent history, and are going to be far more skeptical of China than Duterte's government was in the beginning.
Okay, you mentioned that China doesn't want any compromises because basically it has been getting its way. Whatever it wanted, basically, it was able to achieve. But on the other hand, we also heard experts before say that if China wanted really to be respected and acknowledged as a superpower, someone to be respected within the international community, it also has to play by the rules. Don't you think this face-saving aspect should also work in the case of the Philippines to be able to, let's say, demand China to play by the rules at least more?
I think there's a lot of truth to that if the Philippines actually demands that China play by the rules, right? China's so far what China has been able to do is treat its immediate neighbors in this bullying, coercive way, but then not pay any cost for that on the global stage because the Philippines doesn't raise it globally, the Vietnamese don't raise it globally. You know, it's been 6 years since the arbitration award. The Philippines has never raised the arbitration award in the UN General Assembly. It's never brought it up publicly at any other multinational fora. So, in theory, if the Philippine government, with support from the US and Japan and other partners, tried to make this a problem for China on the international stage, I do think that then there would be incentive for Beijing to compromise because then it would start to eat away at China's bigger goals of global leadership. But so far, that simply hasn't happened.
So you don't see any incentive so far on the part of China to be able to respect the arbitral rule because we're not basically raising it. Which is related to this question by one of our viewers. Do you think the arbitral tribunal's award or decision favoring the Philippines would be leveraged by Bongbong Marcos? Or perhaps to add to this question, how do you think he should leverage this victory, this legal victory by the Philippines?
Well, look, I certainly hope so. The incoming Secretary of National Defense seems to care a great deal about the West Philippine Sea. The DFA is staffed with professionals who care, and I think left to their own devices would love to raise the arbitral award in the UN and ASEAN meetings and every other fora they can think of. Um, I don't know what the president thinks about how to use the arbitral award. I'm not sure that anybody does. He's never really talked about it. Um, if it were used, I do think it would be effective. So the reason that China has not complied with the ruling to date is because there's no direct mechanism to make it right. There's no policeman who's going to kick in Xi Jinping's bedroom door and force him to comply with his arbitration award. That's not the way arbitrations work. International law works because countries see the costs of violating the law as outweighing the benefits. And even for great powers, the Americans, the Brits, the Russians, and before that the Soviets, They complied with the vast majority of arbitrations because it was a headache not to. There was an opportunity cost involved in being seen as violators of international law. China hasn't been made to pay that opportunity cost yet, so we don't know what it would take for China to have to comply.
And basically, in terms of how the international community views us, and perhaps let's talk about missed opportunities. How much missed opportunities uh, did the Philippines have, given the fact that former President Duterte didn't really raise this arbitral victory? And now, in case the new administration decides to raise that, what kind of credibility or face would we have before the international community?
Look, the Philippine government had a very unique opportunity on July 12th, 2016. The entire world was focused on the West Philippine Sea issue for one day. And the Aquino government, with a lot of support from like mindeds in Australia and the US and Japan and Europe, had spent about a year up to that day rallying support, right? Every Philippine embassy in the world was tasked with making sure that their host government was prepared to issue a statement in support of the arbitration award. And that had really worked. 56 countries had gone on the record in advance saying that they would demand compliance with the ruling. And that included every country in Europe, along with all the usual suspects of the US and Canada and New Zealand, Australia, and so on. And then all of that was allowed to disappear on July 12th because these countries were willing to stand up on behalf of the Philippines if the Philippines was going to stand up itself. But when Manila signaled that it wasn't going to do anything and it wasn't going to ask for support, most of those countries kept quiet. So now the Marcos administration or any future administration faces a difficulty of having to rebuild that coalition from scratch because the Duterte government just gave it all away. That's a real problem.
So basically, how do you push the reset button? Because I remember I was covering one ASEAN summit before. I was told that Vietnam and Malaysia were very frustrated with the Philippines early on because we were not invoking or citing the arbitral victory when they wanted that explicitly mentioned in the ASEAN declaration or ASEAN statement, right? So again, moving forward, years later, how do we push the reset button?
It's going to take hard work. I now the one benefit that the Marcos administration has is that over the last really 2 years, you've seen countries step up themselves because they've begun to again see the South China Sea as directly their interests. So the Germans, for the first time, called for China to comply with the ruling about a year and a half ago. The French and the Brits have issued more clear positions on their legal objections to China's claims. So I think there's something there that can be built on, but it will take work. I mean, there's probably 10 or 15 countries that are going to be easy to get, and the rest of the 54, they're going to take hard work because not only have they largely moved on to other issues, but they're going to be highly skeptical of the ability of a Philippine government now to follow through because the last Philippine government changed course overnight.
But the fact that we have a new foreign secretary in Secretary Enrique Manalo, don't you think that could signal some stability in the part of the Philippines? He
I
is a
think
career diplomat, well respected.
yes, and look, Secretary Manalo was heavily involved in the preparation for Judgment Day on July 12th. He was Undersecretary of Foreign Affairs at the time. He had a hand in helping craft this international coalition. He was, in addition, the lead negotiator for quite some time on the Code of Conduct talks with the rest of ASEAN. So he knows this issue inside and out, and he knows how much hard work, particularly the Aquino government, put into building that coalition. If he's given the green light by Malacanang, I have no doubt that he'll get to work rebuilding.
Mm. And by the way, the structures that were built by China, the reclamation in portions of the South China Sea, including the West Philippine Sea, are basically completed, right? They have been
Yeah, I
completed.
mean, They've been completed for years and years. So
Yeah.
the islands themselves were built basically by mid 2016. All the land mass was done, and then all the structures, the runways and the missile shelters and the fuel storage, all of that was done by the end of 2017. So
Mm.
when we talk about militarization of the South China Sea Islands, we're not really talking about building anymore. We're talking about what China uses them for, what kind of
Yeah.
deployments go out. The maritime militia and the Coast Guard, of course, they've been out there every day for at least the last 5 years. The only really new thing we've seen of late is China's begun much more regularly flying patrol aircraft, big patrol aircraft, off of the runways in the Spratlys. And that's important for China because it lets China maintain a 24-hour a day intelligence collection capability over the West Philippine Sea. It's also very important for China's Navy because China has two aircraft carriers it wants to operate, but those aircraft carriers can't launch big patrol aircraft. So they need nearby runways to do it for them.
So you don't see China building any new structures anymore because what they had planned to build had been completed already.
I would be surprised if we saw new structures in the Spratlys. China doesn't need more, right? It has more than it needs at this point. It has three air and naval bases in the Spratly Islands. Those are pretty redundant. It could, I could imagine, build something small, unmanned platforms or tiny outposts on places like Bajo de Masinloc
Yeah,
just to stake
Scarborough.
a claim. But I don't see a new big island going in because it's not really clear what it's needed for.
Yeah, because I remember there was this concept. I think it came from the Japanese, the so-called strategic triangle, right?
Yeah.
And the other corner of that was Bajo de Masinloc, right? Scarborough Shoal.
Right. So this concept, and there's certainly some credibility to it. Is if you look at where China has facilities in the South China Sea, they have one air and naval base up on Woody Island in the Paracels. They have three in the Spratlys. The only place they don't have a place to launch planes is at Scarborough, at Bal de Massillon. My argument would be, I think there's some truth to that on the surveillance side. China probably wants to have radar and signals intelligence and communications facilities on the reef because then it can better monitor Luzon, all U.S. Philippine activity in and out of Manila Bay and Subic Bay, and it can also monitor the Strait of Taiwan.
Mm.
But that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to build a big airstrip or a new Navy base or anything like that. I think that would be a pretty small facility.
But somehow, do you think they were able to close the loop, so to speak, already, as far as China is concerned?
Well, day in and day out, they probably do it with vessels. I mean, there are probably a dozen Chinese vessels at Bajo de Masinloc today as we speak. I haven't looked at the latest satellite images, but there's always Chinese boats at the reef. China maintains aerial patrol over the reef, and it can do it from the mainland. It has airstrips close enough that it can do that. So I think that there's probably some plan in a filing cabinet somewhere in PLA headquarters that eventually we're going to build some small, probably unmanned outpost on the reef. But I'm not sure that they're in any rush.
Okay. So what other activities are you expecting China to do in the coming months to be able to somehow firm up their presence in that area?
A lot of it has now become almost routine, right? Every new oil and gas exploration activity by any of the Southeast Asian countries has been blocked for at least the last 4 years. Most recently, the Philippine government tried to start new exploration at Recto Bank in April and were blocked by the China Coast Guard, and so again halted any new exploration. The same is true for the Malaysians and the Vietnamese and Indonesians, and that'll keep up. Continued pressure on fishing, and particularly by China's maritime militia. Continued pressure on the resupply missions to Ayungin Shoal, to the
Yeah.
Sierra Madre. I think China's goal here is to just keep pushing and pushing and pushing until more and more of the peacetime activity becomes impossible or too risky and too expensive. And Beijing's getting to the point where it's basically impossible for Manila or any other Southeast Asian government to attract foreign investment in the oil and gas sector. So really, Chinese companies are the only ones who you can get to do this drilling. Um, Between that and the increasing impossibility of fishing, China's pretty close to controlling the South China Sea without ever having to fight for it.
again, they are close to controlling the South China Sea without having to fight or fire a
If they,
single shot.
yeah, if China gets to the point where the only ships that can operate without Chinese permission are the U.S. Navy and the Philippine Navy, then it's already won.
Yeah.
Because if Filipino civilians can't operate, and Vietnamese civilians, and Indonesian civilians, then international law is already dead in the West Philippine
Mm.
Sea. China has accomplished its goal.
How about the other countries? Canada, Australia, even the French and the Britons. How important is it for them to actually be part of this phone ops?
Hmm. I think that it's extreme. It's seen as extremely important by the Japanese and the Australians. I think that for the rest of this potential coalition, the French, the British, the Germans, the Canadians, the Kiwis, there's interest. It's seen as an important issue, but I'm not sure it's seen as critical in the way that the Americans and the Japanese see it. Partially that's because these countries don't have the same relationship with the Philippines, so they don't view it as direct a security threat. You know, the U.S. has to worry about the Mutual Defense Treaty and the Article 5 commitment. The Japanese and the Australians have extremely close and growing military ties with the Filipinos, so there's a more direct stake there. For the rest of the countries, this is more abstract. It's a question of the law, and they're very worried about how Chinese claims undermine the law, but it's a bit distant from their day to day. And the only way to change that is going to be to have claimant countries,
Mm.
presumably the Philippines, because the Vietnamese have been unwilling to do it, to have Philippine diplomats go in and demand their assistance, demand their support. That would help drive this up the agenda for the rest.
Okay. So if the Philippines, under the new administration of President Bongbong Marcos, would want to actually push the reset button and actually make use of our legal victory in 2016, which particular partners or allies should the Philippines focus on?
The Europeans are the most important party here. I know we all like to say ASEAN, but ASEAN's really not. If we, when it comes down to this, what's going to compel China to comply with the ruling is the weight of international opinion. If the ruling, if its non-compliance with the ruling begins to impose so much reputational cost on Beijing that it makes it harder for China to do other things around the world that it wants to do, then it will look for compromise. And the most important block out there as part of that coalition are the, nearly 30 countries that the Philippines could get to sign on either as members of the EU or as affiliated members who had previously signed statements back in 2017 saying that, or 2016 saying that they would call for compliance with the
Mm.
ruling. So getting them back, that could start a ripple effect that brings other countries on board as well.
Okay. Finally, why are you quite pessimistic about ASEAN at this stage? I, I think I know the answer to my question, but I want to I wanted to come from you.
I am skeptical of ASEAN as an organization playing an effective role on the West Philippine Sea. That doesn't mean that individual countries aren't important.
Yeah.
Singapore, Vietnam, Indonesia, perhaps Malaysia. These are to a degree like minded, they share Philippine concerns, they will be helpful down the line, and there must be coordination with them. But do I think that you're going to convince Laos
Yeah.
to irritate China, who now controls more than 50% of its sovereign debt,
Yeah.
over
They're
fishing
very effective.
rights at
Mm.
Scarborough Shoal? No. I think if Laos has a veto, or if Cambodia or Thailand even have a veto over Philippine rights in the West Philippine Sea, then the Philippines is going to lose.
Yeah, I think they also have to deal with the so-called ASEAN centrality, and before they could come up with the decision, it has to be unanimous. And part of the criticism of ASEAN is that that particular idea of centrality is the one that has been stunting the development of the region, right?
That's right. ASEAN has been talking, negotiating with China on a code of conduct for at least the last 24 years. The Philippines was tasked with writing the first draft of the code of conduct by ASEAN back in 1998. In 24 years, no progress has been made.
Yeah.
The only thing that's changed is that China is in a better position because China continues to unilaterally change the status quo while the Philippines feels compelled to talk and talk and talk, lest it be accused of undermining ASEAN centrality.
And do you think a code of conduct, legally binding one, would be more detrimental to the interests of the Philippines and other ASEAN countries and be more beneficial to China if it is signed or completed at this time?
Well, it would depend on the details. I obviously a bad code of conduct is worse than no code at all. Um,
Yeah.
Now, to date, the Vietnamese in particular have been very good at blocking all bad Chinese proposals. Philippines has been back and forth depending on who was SFA at the time. So, but in general, I don't really have a lot of fear that ASEAN is going to sign a bad code with China. The problem is that China's not interested in signing a good one. So the real question is abandon the code process or continue to talk forever with no end in sight.
Okay. Gregory Poling, thank you for joining us on the program. Always a pleasure. God bless.
Thank you, Christian. It's great to see you again.
Thank you. Thank you.